Commandant Dahl gives no sign of guilt or compassion throughout most of the novel. And how does he see his behavior and his beliefs about the war and the human beings whose lives he controls?
Well, I mean, they all had a head full of eugenics and racial rubbish. And eugenics was taken very seriously and acted upon in America in the interwar period and earlier. And it was pseudo-scientific garbage, since wholly discredited. So they had that sort of underpinning, you couldn't even call it an ideology, a confirmation of prejudice. They had that. And, when Dole sees issues of Der Stürmer, the illiterate hate sheets run by Julius Streicher, the child-molesting Gauleiter of Franconia, he very much disapproves. He says it gives serious anti-Semitism a bad name. So they thought it was intellectually respectable what they were doing, even though Goebbels admitted that it's pretty barbaric, the method they're using. And, once the value of human life has collapsed in your moral universe, then beware, because death then, it's not so much the collapse of life as the glorification of death, and death became the rallying cry for this type. So he justifies himself with euphemisms and tautologies, and his whole narrative is meant to be horrific as prose as well. He has awful habits of genteelisms and elegant variation and even grammar. His mind is a mess. We've just seen that the character of Eichmann has been reassessed. Hannah Arendt, in her brilliant book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was perhaps the worst court reporter of all time, because she completely accepted his self-projection as someone who was just a mindless bureaucrat. Whereas, in fact, we have him quoted as saying things like, "I will leap joyfully into my grave knowing that I'm responsible for the disposal of 5 million," or whatever the figure he had, that I have it not on my conscience, but whatever the reverse of a conscience is, that this is a source of strength for him. But they were banal types, but once they started killing, they weren't banal anymore.
The chemical conglomerate IG Farben has a strong presence in your novel, though very much in the background. What was your interest in that?
Well, I was astonished to find out that IG Farben, world-famous conglomerate, had its own concentration camp in Auschwitz, KL3, because it was to house the workforce of the Bühne-Wacker. Now, Bühne was synthetic rubber, and there was the biggest and most advanced plant in Europe was established in the Auschwitz area, the zone of interest, which was the greater area of Auschwitz. And when it was going to be fully online, this one factory would consume more electricity than Berlin. That was the scale of it. And they were making synthetic rubber, which is vitally necessary for making war. You can't do it without rubber any more than you can do it without ball bearings. Synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. And if they had achieved that, then they would have had no need of the Romanian oil fields, etc. They would have won autarky. They would have been self-sufficient and hugely strengthened by that. Now, my main protagonist, you could certainly call him the hero of this novel, works at Bühne. He goes from a sort of passive sabotage to active sabotage, to summarize brutally, in the name of love, because he's in love with the commandant's wife. So Bühne is a vital part of the story, as well as being incredibly shocking, and dozens of Farben executives got quite light sentences for the crimes of slavery, spoliation, and mass murder. 30,000 Jews died in the Bühne-Wacker.
Yeah, I didn't think one could still be shocked by what took place there, but you quote from a letter from Farben's subsidiary, the pharmaceutical company Bayer, about the purchase of women for experiments.
Yes, and it says, unfortunately, they all died during the experiment, so we'd like another batch of 150 women, I think it was. Yes, this letter exists. Very shocking.
Were there things that surprised you in your research?
I was very surprised by how money grubbing it was. Amazing, it's full headlight hypocrisy when that was the main crime of the Jews, was that they were acquisitive. But they were outdone by the Germans. The Jews didn't take the Aryans' gold from their teeth as the Germans did. I was very surprised by how system-wide that was. It begins with a boycott, then confiscations, then Aryanization of businesses. The thoroughness, the German thoroughness of that was shocking. Another thing I found very shocking was the whole other universe of suffering that were the Polish ghettos. How exquisitely horrible they made life for the Jews of the ghettos. A whole other little world of intense suffering that invariably ended in the death camps.
And this horrible, ironic twist that, for instance, after Kristallnacht and all these synagogues were destroyed, the Jews had to pay for the cleanup.
That's right. Yes, no, they were having to pay for their own extermination. I was shattered when I read that they often paid their own way to Auschwitz via the Jewish councils usually, and the standard fare was so many pfennigs per kilometre, third-class fare. And they were one-way tickets and free for those under 12. The perfection of moral squalor is striking.
The Zone of Interest is largely written from the perspective of two German officers. We see their anxieties about the war, their personal lives, how they respond to the Holocaust. Why did you want to write this from the German point of view?
Well, it's not entirely from the German point of view. There's a third narrator whose chapters are shorter, who's a Polish Jew in the Sonderkommando, and these were the undertakers of the Holocaust. Men degraded beyond anything you can imagine. They were the ones who sheared the hair and removed the fillings and ground the bones, etc., etc. So it's not wholly German. Also, my main narrator, Thompson, who works at the Buna factory, is committed to losing the war. He's someone who is never deluded by this rush of power that turned the heads of all the other Germans. The defeat of France in 1940, I think the Holocaust wouldn't have taken place without that, because no one could deny Hitler anything after that miraculous victory. And the power surge that Germany had been looking for ever since Bismarck, there it was. And power corrupts. That's not a metaphor. That's a reality. But my main narrator is a voice, I think, that anyone can recognize. This is the voice of reason. It takes a while for you to see his true colors, but he is the moral counterweight to Dole.
This officer, Angelus Thompson, or he's known as Golo, as you say, he's a voice of reason. He's not a Nazi sympathizer, though he has to dissemble. How unusual would he have been?
Not at all unusual. I think Sebastian Haffner, in a book called Germany, Jekyll and Hyde, written in 1940, incredibly prescient, written in London. He's German. He got out in 1939. He said that about 40% of Germans were disloyal in their hearts, and a small fraction of them would be consciously and actively impeding the war effort. So, a huge chunk of Germany never had sympathy, and Bavaria never had sympathy. It's sort of spotty.
Really? Because we tend to associate the area around Munich.
But there was something so vulgar about Hitler that, this is according to George Steiner, Bavarians never accepted him. So, what most people did, and my Golo Thompson does it to an extent, is that Hafner describes this process very well in a book called Defying Hitler, when he was in his 20s as Hitler was rising. He said you close off all sorts of parts of your mind, various parts of your mind, and you think, I'll let that go, that scruple, that delicacy, I'll let it go. And just saying every day saying, no, let it go, until you're hideously reduced. They called it inner exile. You just turn in on yourself because the outer reality is not only horrific, but completely unreal. When he woke up in the morning that Hitler was named Chancellor, he said the external world looked ersatz because the unreality of the situation. That was at least as common with the Germans, when you include all the émigrés too, those who fled, got out, who detached themselves, like Thomas Mann, etc. They never got more than about 40% or 38% of the German vote, even though it was the highest notched up in the whole Weimar period. It still wasn't anything like a majority.
You've described the Holocaust as a very thorough Germanic exploration of evil. Was there something about it that made it particularly German?
Just that, when you decide to do it, you do it in the most literalist way possible, leaving no stone unturned because it might have something evil under it that will be of use to you. I think the sort of assiduity of the whole thing is German. My father had a typology for some European countries where he said, is there a relationship between cuisine and the people? And he says, let's think. England, nasty food, nice people. France, nice food, nasty people. Spain, nice people, nasty food. Italy, nice people, nice food. Germany, nasty food, nasty people. I don't think that's true. I think that when I was last in Germany, I was very impressed by this fact, and I think this shows that they've done the work, and the fact that young people are eager to talk about it. Not just willing, but eager. And when you compare that with France, that hasn't barely made one baby step of recognition of its guilt in those years, I was very impressed by Germany. They've done all the sort of squirming in the 70s and 80s when they tried to contextualize it, as they say, try to historicize it, relativize it, saying that, well, the Allied bombing of Germany was just as hideous, and they stopped doing that. They accept the exceptionalism now. So it's not something inherent in the Germans. It's inherent in their history post-1871. Bismarck did not unify Germany. On the contrary, he organized a sort of land grab to Prussia's benefit. Prussia, the grasping, expansionist state, became the whole German identity, which it had never been before. And that, together with a whole chain of historical flukes, meant that when 1933 came round, they somehow accepted Hitler. A man who foamed at the mouth when he spoke, a man who was responsible for scores of political murders to get where he was, an Austrian tramp whose education ended at the age of 15, I think. They swallowed that.
Have you ever imagined yourself in either role, victim or perpetrator, and asked yourself what you would have done?
I certainly thought about it. I can't really get there. I mean, I can't see myself as a perpetrator. Absolutely impossible to think of myself as that. If a victim, then how would I have behaved? I don't know. But I can imagine myself very easily in an Allied army. Even more, his war trilogy begins with the hero Guy Crouchback saying there was something very clarifying about seeing the enemy. There it was, huge and ugly, and you at least knew what lay in front of you and what had to be done. destroying that. And I'm sure I would have felt all that in 1939 if I'd been 20 years old then.
For those who did survive the camps, you say they needed to be in possession of certain qualities.
Yeah. Well, luck was the main one, and you had to have the luck of getting an indoor job. Most people who went to Auschwitz were never tattooed and never on the work list. They were killed within an hour of getting there. Those who survived the selection tended to last 3 months. But if you had an inside job, you at least had a chance. The other qualities you needed were a talent for inconspicuousness, moral values. Those who gave those up never survived, even no matter how fiercely and unscrupulously they struggled. The constantly nurtured sense of innocence and Solzhenitsyn also stresses this again and again in the Gulag Archipelago, and again, luck. It wasn't through your qualities entirely that you survived. Now, in solidarity with another group or with an individual, you couldn't do it without that. We know this ex post facto, and I don't think anyone knew it on the way in.
When we talked a while back, you said you thought that comedy was the only form left for novels, that tragedy, satire, and romance weren't going to work anymore. How does that fit a novel like The Zone of Interest?
Well, I would go further than that and say that comedy has always been the only form. That might sound odd, but you go through the English novelists, they're all, anyone who's any good is funny, Nabokov said. Same with the Americans. I mean, some are more solemn than others, but all the Russians are funny, including Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Gogol.
Dostoevsky?
Yes, it's very funny. The double is a scream. Oh, yeah. So I would, expand it. I think...
So all my adolescent angst was misplaced in reading Diary from the Underground and all that?
No, but it's all very funny. I mean, he is a very funny writer. He has this reputation for, brooding gloom, but he's very funny. There's a reason why comedy... By the way, let's expand the category to include high seriousness as well. But there's a reason why all good writers are funny, and that's because life is funny. Now, in the West, certainly, our great experiment with the opposite of comedy, which is gloom and humorlessness and pain, was after the Second World War, where quite understandably there was slogans like "no poetry after Auschwitz" were common and untrue. There was poetry during Auschwitz, Paul Celan. But then it was, Beckett et al., where the curtain opens and there is a naked hermit on a cracked toilet on an otherwise deserted stage. That sort of stuff. It was just, I think, a complete wrong turning and utterly against the spirit of what literature is.
That's interesting. So you think Dostoevsky was funnier than Beckett?
Yes, I do. I know people who think Beckett's funny, but I sort of groan 10 times a page when I try and read him. And I'm talking about his fiction rather than his... I don't read plays for pleasure unless they're written by Shakespeare. I'm not interested in reading page upon page of dialogue. Every writer knows that dialogue is the easiest thing to write. You can do that in your spare time. Prose is the hard thing, where the writer had to exhibit his pain, his suffering. All that is, you can boot that out without diminishing the canon by an ounce, in my view.
So the comedy in The Zone of Interest, it percolates through Dahl's vocabulary, the commandant, and the way he reflects on women, and because it's such a dire environment, and particularly in terms of, as you alluded to earlier, the Saunders, the perspective of this Jew who's forced to do terrible things and knows he's going to die anyway.
Well, I wanted to write about Dahl with contempt, and I wanted to ridicule him, as well as being disgusting and evil and all the rest of it. The Nazi project was incredibly stupid and incredibly ridiculous, and I didn't want to exclude those anathemas from my book. But let's be clear about comedy. When people think of laughter, they think that it's all high spirits. Laughter is a very, very nuanced and complicated expression of emotion. Writing about Lolita, I said in an essay that maybe it's the richest comedy in the language because it gets so many registers of laughter. The laughter of disgust, of self-disgust. There are some very fierce emotions included in laughter. It's not just frivolous giggling. It's a deep part of us. So I would say satire more than comedy in my dealings with Dole. Satire being militant irony.
Militant in its desire
to destroy and to excoriate, to leave nothing, to demolish. That's what the satire is there for.
Martin Amis in New York. He's my guest today on Writers and Company on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM Radio, and around the world on cbc.ca. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Martin Amis, I'd like to look for a moment at your last novel, Lionel Asbo. You offer a rather affectionate portrait of a low-life thug, Lionel, who lives in the fictional London borough of Diston. What is it you respond to in a character like that?
Well, I think that British working-class culture is full of beauty and poetry and comedy, and I've always responded to it. It's always been part of my life. And I thought, what would happen what does happen when someone like Lionel, who's a subsistence criminal, not very good at it, very violent, but not successful as a criminal, when he wins a fantastic amount of money on the lottery. It's the only time he ever goes in for it, and he wins £150 million. And it's that kind of violent wrenching of... what I'm interested in all my fiction is extremism, is extremes. I realized after a few novels that the only people who are missing from my fictional world are the middle classes. They're not to be found in my books. It's the high and the low, and not what's in between. I can at least say that the middle classes are very well served elsewhere. There are plenty of writers who write about no one else. So I just thought it's not my patch, that folk of the middling sort are not my patch.
Oh, they're the patch of some of your friends like Julian Barnes and Ian McEwan. Indeed,
most other British writers.
But when you say working class, I mean, you're not. It's more like an underclass. I mean, what is this appetite for thugs?
Well, yeah, or criminal class. Yeah, the working class has disappeared with the industrial infrastructure. So it's suspended or marooned working class that is edging into poverty and crime.
But tell me about your attraction to characters like Lionel, apart from the fact you say they're easy for you to write. But
there's a part of you that admires characters or is stimulated by characters who behave disgracefully in a way you never would. You sort of get out of yourself. Or you take 1% of your character and imagine that it was 99% of your character. And I find that whole process liberating.
Lionel is, he's sometimes funny, but he's also deeply vengeful and murderously so. I mean, do you feel you understand Lionel?
That's partly what I love about that culture, is that there are some rules that are accepted from birth and never examined, but always adhered to. It's like a prejudice. You should examine all the stuff, all the cargo you get from your parents' generation, and you should reject things and accept things. But it's only the independent mind, the discerning mind, that can do that. So if you do something, if you trespass beyond a certain magnitude with Lionel, then he will dream up something really terrible to do to you back, and he won't question his right to do that. And it's more of a kind of, it's a culture of you accept these inherited formulations. You don't examine them.
It's not obvious whether or not Lionel is intelligent, but he's certainly against formal education, and he lends his studious nephew a laptop, not for school, but for porn. What did you want to say about how people like Lionel do or don't survive without an education?
Lionel Asbo, the novel, is very much about education. And as a novelist, I feel I'm in the education business, not relaying information, but relaying perceptions and trying to enrich the reader's mind. But I've always thought it was an absolute tragedy that there's so much intelligence and talent down there in the underclass. And it's always been there. And I think what happens is, if you're intelligent down there, at a certain point in your adolescence probably, you think, well, what use is intelligence to me? No one's bringing it on, no one's developing it. And you turn against intelligence, and this is what Lionel's done. You reject intelligence, and you take a pride in being stupid. I mean, Lionel is intelligent on some level, but he's specialized in being stupid all his life.
You've said there's a lot of anti-intellectualism in Britain. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery. I think it has to do with how ancient the culture is. I think there's not much of it in America because it's a young country, and when it was formulating its national myths and its culture and its ethos, I think every American sensed, if only subconsciously, that writers would play a part in defining what America was. Was it just a collection of Italians, Brits, Germans, Jews, or was it a place with a soul and a heart? But in England, that was all done in the 16th century by Shakespeare, and they don't need intellectuals or writers telling them who they are. The views of an intellectual, while sought out because they're hoping they're going to trip up, their views are actually valued less than those of the man in the street.
So you don't think there's a similar anti-intellectualism in the U.S.?
Well, it doesn't take anything like the same form.
Well, they're nicer to their writers, but not to...
They're nicer to their writers.
Not to others, sort of...
Yes, well, in Britain, they hate even scientists, patronizing about scientists. They call them boffins, pointy heads and boffins. Boffins have discovered that picturing this collection of granddads who are pottering around in a laboratory, it's anti-elitism too, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I wonder how anti-elitist those people feel when they get on an airplane or when they go to see a heart specialist. Do they hate excellence then? No. But there are some fields that are very vulnerable to levelism, as I call it, to egalitarianism. And literature is one of them.
Martin Amis, your novel, Lionel Asbo, doesn't show England in a particularly positive light. I mean, there's crime and poor education, rough neighborhoods, and a general sense of decrepitude. But you say the subtitle of the book, State of England, was intended ironically.
Only in that there used to be such a thing as the State of England novel. It was almost a genre unto itself. And in these novels by C.P. Snow and people like that, lots of academics and people who work in institutions talk in the same voice, identical voice, about what is the state of England. I was never going to do anything like that, so mine is a very tangential look at the state of England. But I think that the criminal who wins the lottery and becomes a national figure, and a much loved national figure, says in itself a great deal about England. That sort of sentimentality, the admiration for someone who is merely well known, admiration for someone who got rich without using work of mind. It's sort of many English themes are taken up there.
Well, class used to be the social yardstick in Britain, and now money seems to trump that. I mean, what?
Yeah, I mean, except for they still exist, the upper classes, but they're very reduced and much quieter than they used to be. It was really Thatcher who undermined the class system, which was one of the most powerful forces in daily life when I was a young man. now is seldom felt, really. It's education and money that are dominant.
Although isn't something like 80% of Cameron's cabinet or from Eton or something like that? Or?
Yeah, a good journalist called Nick Cohen wrote a very prescient book called Waiting for the Etonians. But it was Thatcher who got rid of the Etonians, who really separated the Conservative Party from the aristocracy, and that was done then. I mean, Eton is itself a much more meritocratic place than it used to be, although it's not so class-based, money-based, but not class-based.
Do you think it's better that money? I mean, is there a difference when money rules rather than class?
Well, money is clear improvement on class. What is being upper class? It just means that your distant ancestor did all the gouging and skanking and slave driving, and that fortune was amassed earlier. It's still money. Class was just the sort of superstructure of all that, the airs and graces of all that. So money is clear improvement.
Even though what you're satirizing is totally unearned money, the lottery lout.
Yeah, in the case of that novel, yes.
At one point, Lionel becomes a kind of national symbol of intransigence. I mean, you write of peculiarly English intransigence in the face of relentlessly blighted hopes. Now, I know you're talking about football here, but it seems to be also about something more.
Yes, well, I said 35 years ago that England leads the world in nothing but decline. But I think it's all in all, despite everything, which is saying something, a rather dignified loss of prepotence and preeminence in the world, going from the largest empire the world had ever seen to a near bankrupt nation in 10 years. So couldn't have been more traumatic. And yet, the English virtues, the British virtues got us through that without much bloodshed, the Suez, but not much else. And the various legacies of imperialism have been atrocious for the world, but no onset of illusion. Now, I think we're already seeing American decline, the beginnings of it. It won't be there for another 25, 30 years. It won't be a reality. But I think there's a sort of a premonitory extremism in America. What is being pushed to the extreme? America, the American idea, is becoming more American, more intensely and blindly American all the time. I could give you chapter and verse, but we'd need a lot more time. Things like gun control, which is getting looser, and mass incarceration based on race, or though it's never admitted, that's the reality, and capital punishment and other barbarisms are not diminishing. And I think out in the world you might well see American illusion running rampant.
So you might be coming up with a State of America novel?
Yes, yeah, I might well. I've been reading a lot of left-wing history, and there was a very good stylish book by Mark Mazower about Europe in the 20th century, or first half of the 20th century, called Dark Continent, meaning not Africa, but Europe. And I think that could apply to America too. It has a glorious sort of founding moment in War of Independence, the revolution, the throwing off of the imperial shackles, perhaps the only revolution in history that fulfilled its promise to a large extent and did not become a kind of bloodbath. So you have that, but there are also great scars and shadows in American history, and those things don't go away.
You've been living in the U.S. since 2011. Where is home for you?
I don't have a home. I realize that I don't really know what it's like to love my country, because I'm not sure which it is, and there's so much not to love, I feel. The only country I've ever loved is Uruguay, where we lived for 3 years.
Because your wife, Isabel Fonseca, is part Uruguayan?
Half Uruguayan, although a New Yorker through and through. and it was certainly possible to love Uruguay. I don't love a country, though, and I have no country that I identify with, and I have no time now anymore. My time is sort of slipping away, and the present looks strange to me. I don't fit in very well with it, I feel. I mean, I don't have any doubts about my identity. That's one of the great things about being English, is that it just never comes up. It's just not a subject. And it's only when it's threatened or transposed or disrupted that you begin to think about your identity. So it's not a difficulty having to do with identity. It's just the realization that nationalist feeling, patriotic feeling, is just not there, except when I watch international football and England are struggling away as usual. Then I feel the emotions of religion and war, but not otherwise.
When you say you're not that comfortable with the present, what are you thinking of?
Well, it's beyond me technologically now, and people look strange to me. The young, I'm thinking more of the sort of prosperous young. They look sort of wised up and very narrow in their interests and materialistic in a way that feels strange to me.
You've said that nowadays writers can outlive their talent thanks to increased longevity. What do you do in the face of that?
You go on until it's no good. And believe me, many writers go on long beyond the fact that what they're writing is no good.
Do they know?
No, well, I think they suspect, but they keep on with it, and sometimes are very indulged by reviewers. And I think if you get a readership, that it does stay with you. It's slow to see that your energies are exhausted. I don't feel I'm close to that yet, but it tends to happen when the biblical span is exhausted. 70 is the usual watermark. Although medical science has pushed that up, both Norman Mailer and Saul Bellow wrote really very respectable novels in their mid-80s. And Herman Wouk, I think, finished one not long ago, and he's 98 or 99. So,
and James Salter and
yes,
William Trevor.
William Trevor. There are exceptions, but all the writers I care about, that I read very closely, I can see it's sort of beginning to die off. And anyone over, I think, 55 has got a diminishing vocabulary. That's a medical fact. And as I said often enough, this is a question that never came up before, because Shakespeare died at 56, Dickens at 58, Jane Austen 43, Keats 26. They weren't around long enough to go off.
In terms of the subject of longevity, what do you think it is that makes a work enduring?
Well, that's the only judge of value there is how long it lasts. Or 90%, 95% of reviewing and even criticism is just rhetoric. It's just pretending that the things I like, this has the things I like, and I'm praising it. That's or the obverse. There are no criteria. No one's ever found a way of evaluating literature, except this question of maybe memorability is a good judge, being mnemogenic, as Nabokov put it. But time is the only judge with any credentials. And I think the stuff that lasts is the stuff that renews itself for other generations. And that's why one, in the signing queue after the reading, that's why you look with voracious eyes at young people. And if you've got a very good fan in his 20s or her 20s, then you know you're going to live for another at least half a century more after you're dead, because they'll still be looking at you, reading you.
Who do you think will be around in 100 years?
Idle to say. I only read the dead anyway. I read people who are at least a generation older than me. I read my friends, but I don't read my youngers unless they're my friends, because it's an uneconomical way of organizing your reading, to take something that has stood the test of time up to a point already, and then you're far more likely to find something of real interest.
You've taken on a lot of dark subjects, the Holocaust, the Soviet Gulag, nuclear annihilation, 9/11, but there's a sense of hope that buoys your novels. Where do you think that comes from?
A sort of love of innocence. I do admire innocence, and it's a quality in diminishing supply, just in the nature of things, that the world itself is getting less innocent with every year because its history gets longer. But it's still there, and no, I take a lot of pleasure from, as you do when you get older, from there's a sort of, you're saying goodbye to it all, and that's it makes everything look very alive and gives it a good color.
Saying goodbye doesn't sound that cheerful.
Well, it's got to be done. You know, when you arrive, you're saying hi, and here I am, and this is what I can do. And now it's the other process. It's you're making preparations for departure. When I woke up on my 60th birthday, I had a new thought in my head, which was, this can't turn out well. Well, I used to think, maybe clever you, that there's a way out for you, that you don't have to submit to the woods decay and fall. But there isn't, and you get the hang of that in your 60s.
Well, on that happy note, I want to thank you again. It's such a delight to talk to you.
Thank you. That was very good fun.
Martin Amis in New York. The Zone of Interest has just been published by Knopf Canada. Writers and Company is produced by Mary Stinson. Nancy McElveen is associate producer. Technical operations by Tim Lorimer. You can also hear Writers and Company through online streaming on our website. Just go to cbc.ca/writersandcompany, and the show is available as a podcast. You can find book news, reading lists, and recommendations at cbcbooks.ca. And we always like to hear from you. Our email address is writersandco@cbc.ca, and the telephone number is 416-205-6631. The executive producer is Tara Mora. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Next week, a look back at English novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard. She died last January. Famous for the Cazalet Chronicle and a dozen other books, she was also, at a crucial time in his life, Martin Amis's stepmother, someone who encouraged him to read and pursue his studies. Next week, my conversation with Elizabeth Jane Howard about her memoir, Slipstream. I hope you'll join me.